Can you hear me? Can you? Yeah, you can. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for showing up here. I know that it's so convenient to stay home and to watch online, so this is really doubly appreciated. And I am pretty convinced that you are not going to regret it. So good evening again. In my role as the Executive Director of AMI-Quebec, I am pleased to welcome Robert Whitaker as the keynote speaker at this special public lecture dedicated to rethinking psychiatry. AMI-Quebec is a family association that for the past 45 years has been addressing the needs of families challenged by mental health difficulties and illnesses. In addition to our principal goal of guiding and supporting families, we try to share emerging knowledge related to mental health, even when it is controversial or difficult to digest. We invited Robert Whitaker because we believe he has something important to say. And while it may not be obvious to everyone, his is a hopeful message with encouraging prospects. Some 500 years ago, Copernicus formulated a model of the universe that placed the sun rather than Earth at its center, a model that triggered the Copernican revolution and made a pioneering contribution to the scientific revolution. Robert Whitaker is not Copernicus and may not have the same impact in his field Copernicus had on the scientific revolution. However, it seems to me that he reflects a similar courage by challenging the status quo and asking questions that many would prefer he didn't ask. This is no small feat in an era where so much effort has been made to explain mental illness as a brain disease. The 1990s were dubbed the decade of the brain. Nancy Andreessen, a highly respected American neuroscientist and neuropsychiatrist, published in 1983, The Broken Brain, The Biological Revolution in Psychiatry, followed by Peter Kramer's 1993 book, Listening to Prozac, which discussed how the advance of the antidepressant drug Prozac might change the way we see personality and the relationship between neurology and personality. Both were bestsellers and were quickly embraced by many in the healthcare community and the public. As he was seeking answers to many questions he uncovered while investigating the history of psychiatry, Robert Whitaker debunked some of the most commonly held theories about mental illness, especially the notion that it is a brain disease. He elaborated his findings and observations in his 2010 Anatomy of an Epidemic, Magic Bullets, Psychiatric Drugs, and the Astonishing Rise of Mental Illness that won the US Investigative Reporters and Editors Book Award for Best Investigative Journalism. The 3 books he wrote about the history of psychiatry may not have been bestsellers, and yet they may have a significant impact on this field as Copernicus' writing did on our understanding of the physical world. I think that you want to hear what Robert Whitaker has to say. So please, Robert Whitaker.
Well, first of all, I have to say that was a very nice introduction. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to thank you for the invitation from AMI-Quebec. And I have to say it's so nice to actually not be in front of a computer screen and talking to people in person, so this is a real pleasure. I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. That introduction actually really set the stage for what I'll be talking about in a nice way. And so the title, Rethinking Psychiatry. Well, if you go back to the narrative, the understanding that has driven our societal thinking about psychiatric disorders for the last 40 years, it really goes back to 1980 when the American Psychiatric Association published the third edition of its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And that was the moment they said, we're going to conceive of psychiatric disorders as brain illnesses, as discrete brain illnesses. And as Ellis said, in 1983, Nancy Andreasen put forth this new conception of psychiatric disorders. And the narrative very quickly was psychiatry is discovering that psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia, bipolar, depression are due to chemical imbalances in the brain, and that we now have drugs that fix those chemical imbalances like insulin for diabetes. Now that's a story of extraordinary medical progress because we all know how incredibly complex the brain is. And the story we were being told is that they had discovered the very molecules that cause madness, schizophrenia, cause depression, cause bipolar, and they could fix it. And if that story is correct, I'd say that's the greatest medical advance in history, given the complexity of the brain. And so that's how we organized our thinking around that narrative. And that narrative also, and she mentioned Peter Kramer, that was part of this great expansion of the psychiatric enterprise. By that I mean the diagnosing of people dramatically increased, the use of psychiatric drugs dramatically increased, and the way we thought about our kids and ourselves, it all changed around that narrative. Now, here it is 2022, and what you're now hearing is a lot of calls, even from within psychiatry, to rethink that whole story, that we're at a time we need to have a paradigm shift in our thinking. And why is that? There's really two reasons. One, here we are 42 years later. That story, that conception of psychiatric disorders was actually a hypothesis. It didn't arise from discoveries of actual abnormalities in people, of chemical imbalances. It was a hypothesis that was then going to be investigated. And that it is now very well understood that hypothesis didn't prove to be true. And the pathology of, quote, the biology of mental disorders remains unknown. And you'll see, and when we go through this talk, it's now understood that the drugs, psychiatric drugs, do not fix any known pathology because there is no known pathology that has come up. That's the first reason. In other words, that disease model was never validated by scientific discoveries. They thought it would be, and you'll hear tonight where Nancy Andreasen says it's a hypothesis, we hope will prove it. And then the second thing is this. As we've gone down this path and more people have been diagnosed and treated, if it were effective, you would expect the burden of psychiatric disorders in society to diminish, to lessen. And that's generally what happens when you get effective treatments and more people diagnosed for discrete illnesses. But what you see instead is the burden of psychiatric disorders is going up and up, has gone up steadily for the last 40 years in country after country. And for example, with our kids, we have more and more kids who are struggling with psychiatric difficulties. So this disease model didn't pan out in scientific circles, but in clinical circles, it also didn't prove to be a great way to treat psychiatric distress in a way that benefited society as a whole, and also, even on individual level, had a propensity to produce good outcomes. And so what you're hearing now, and this is not just coming from me, now, in 2011, Anatomy of an Epidemic was seen as sort of a book of heresy. It isn't anymore. And what you see from within the institution now is people saying, we have to rethink this. I'll give you 3 quick examples. Tom Insel, who was the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health, recently wrote a book, Healing, and he said, what's gone wrong? We're getting more people treated, and more people diagnosed, and yet the burden of these disorders just keeps going up. We have to do something different. And in his book, he talks about sort of expanding our thinking about what are the causes of mental disorders and how to treat them. The World Health Organization last year put out a large book, and they said, we need a revolution in our thinking. We need to move away from this disease model, and we need to embrace a more holistic model about how mental disorders arise within cultural contexts. So they called for it. And then the outgoing special rapporteur for health, the UN Special Rapporteur for Health, Daniel Purvis, also said when he left his position a couple of years ago, we need a revolution. We need a paradigm shift in thinking. So what I'm going to do today in the next 45 minutes is go through quickly the history of what predated 1980, because there's a real lesson to learn from what predated 1980, how we got the disease model, where it was shown not to be valid, and then we'll look at, when we put those two parts together, we'll see what are the opportunities for going forward. What can we reimagine? What can we imagine as a new way of thinking about psychiatry, how we can conceive of them, and how we as a society respond to them? What do we do to improve, helping people stay well, or if they're struggling, get well? Now, the optimistic part of this actually comes from the period before 1980. And what you need to know when you think about the merits of a medical intervention is this: what is the natural capacity to recover from that disorder? And you've all heard of it. Hippocrates says, do no harm, and we usually think about it this way: don't make your patients worse, right? But that's actually not what Hippocrates was really saying. He was saying is you need to know the natural capacity to recover from any illness, and then your intervention has to beat that natural capacity to recover. So for example, let's say you have an illness where you treat them for whatever the illness might be. This is just, in the abstract. And a year later, 50% of the people have recovered, the illness is gone, and the other 50 they're just the same as they were at the beginning. No one's been made worse. Now, doctors will say that's an effective medical intervention, okay? Because 50% recovered. No one got worse. But Hippocrates says, no, you don't know that. Hippocrates says you got to know what is the natural capacity to recover. And if the natural capacity to recover is that 70% are well at the end of 1 year, and the remaining 30% are just the same, your intervention has actually lowered the recovery rate, and in that way it has done harm. So as a very beginning thing here today, we need to go back pre-1980 and look at what does the scientific literature, epidemiological literature, tell us about the natural capacity, or what is the natural spectrum of outcomes for things like schizophrenia, bipolar, mania, depression. And what we're going to find in that first part of this thing is a reason for optimism. Now, schizophrenia, one of the things I did when looking at this is I went and looked at outcomes for schizophrenia patients from 1945 to 1955. Now, to try to understand this natural spectrum of outcomes. And the reason for that decade is this. Before 1945, there were eugenic ideas about people diagnosed with schizophrenia. The idea was that they had bad genes. This goes back to the late 1800s and in the early 1900s. And the thought was, because they have bad genes, you needed to lock them up in asylums and not let them propagate their bad genes. So for up until 1945, there was a lot of thinking, you just need to lock people diagnosed with schizophrenia away. But eugenics becomes a discredited theory at the end of World War II, because of course that's what's behind Nazi Germany. And there's another thing that happens in 1945 that leads to a sort of paradigm shift in thinking. It's returning soldiers. So soldiers in World War II, many of them have sort of breakdowns, nervous breakdowns. And what they began to realize is, with a period of time, many of those people could get better. They had an episode of illness, and then they could recover. So, beginning in 1945, the idea is we can treat even people diagnosed with schizophrenia, and with time, many will get better and can leave. And now the reason you stop at 1955 is because 1955 is when the antipsychotics are first introduced. So we have this 10-year window where you sort of are seeing some sort of the natural capacity to recover. So I went back into that literature, first in the United States, and here's what you find. It's quite a surprise. That anywhere from 65 to 70% of people diagnosed with the first episode of schizophrenia would be discharged within a year. Now, this is before there were antipsychotic medications. And then in studies that followed people up of the first episode cohort for 3 and 5 years, you'd find something like 65, 70% living in the community independently. Now, this is before we had disability systems, et cetera, to provide social services. So, for example, employment rates would be above 50% for this cohort, et cetera. And I looked at studies done at Warren State Hospital, Delaware State Hospital, Hillside Hospital in Queens. And then I was asked to give a presentation in Norway on this whole subject. So I looked at discharge rates in Norway, UK, and Scotland, and you saw the same thing. And so what you see in these studies, oh, and there was one more at Boston Psychopathic Hospital, a 5-year study, 100 first episode patients in 1947, and they looked out how many were able to live independently in the community 5 years later. It was 76%. And here's so again and again, what you see in that decade is people being discharged, anywhere from 60 to 70 to 80% in 1 year. And then when they follow the entire cohort out, 3 years, 5 years, about 2/3 able to function in society, and that's before the medication era. And here's what the researchers of the Boston Psychopathic Hospital said, a study. The majority of mental illnesses, especially the most severe, are largely self-limiting in nature if the patient is not subjected to a demeaning experience or loss of rights and liberties. That was their conclusion after what they saw at patients after 5 years. So keep that thought in mind, and we'll go forward just a little bit with schizophrenia, just for a second. So that was from 1945 to 1955. We have a couple more experiments in the more modern time where people weren't initially medicated, and what do you see? One of these studies was done by Maurice Rappaport. There was 3 studies basically done by the NIMH in the 1970s to revisit this question of, can people diagnosed with schizophrenia, are they necessarily going to become chronic? And the first study was done by Maurice Rappaport. Basically, there were 41 people randomized in the hospital for a first episode of schizophrenia who were not put on medications right away in the hospital. They're discharged, and now once they're discharged, they're followed for 3 years, and now if people want to go on medication, they can. So what did they find in that study? 24 of the 41 randomized to that no drug arm got better, discharged, and basically, by far, they had the best outcomes at the end of 3 years. So again, you see that number of 67%. Then there was a study done, a similar study called the Soteria House, was run by the head of schizophrenia studies at the NIMH, a man named Warren Mosher. He thought just being in a community with people could help people get better. And in this form of care, what happened is they weren't initially put on antipsychotics. If they didn't get better, they would be put on it, and then they would be discharged, and they'd see how they were at the end of 2 years. And here's what they found. At the end of 2 years, 40% of the people in this, and this was a 10-year study, recovered and never needed to go on antipsychotics. There was another 40% that needed them for a period of time, and about 20% become chronically ill. So again, you start to see the spectrum of outcomes and a much more optimistic vision of things. And then finally, there was a study done by Martin Harrow and Tom Job, came out of the University of Chicago. They followed people diagnosed either with schizophrenia, first episode of schizophrenia mostly, or milder forms of psychotic disorders. They followed them for, now it's up to 20 years. But of the 64 diagnosed with schizophrenia, and just looking at the possibility of recovery, there were 25 who stopped taking their medication, mostly by year 2. And here's what happened. Here was their course of their outcome. At year 2, they weren't doing so well, actually. There was still a lot of symptoms, anxiety, that sort of thing. But there was this incredible period of healing between year 2 and 4.5, such that by the end of the fourth 4.5 years, 40% were in recovery, meaning they were asymptomatic and were working or back in school and had a decent social life. And over the course of, at the end of 15 years, he divided the outcomes in this way. He said, for the people who stopped taking medication, 40% just recovered, got better, and stayed well. 40% had fair outcomes where they would now and then have a relapse, and 20% became chronically ill. And by the way, just for his conclusion was, these were much better outcomes for those who followed the conventional care. He said his conclusion, this was the best longitudinal study, was that people who are able to get off have significantly better global outcomes. But really the message here with their study and these other studies is, you're seeing that for many people can be a time of psychosis, okay? And that's even with schizophrenia. But there's some people going to end up chronically ill, you see that as well. How about bipolar illness or mania? Going back way back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a man named Emil Kreplin who studied outcomes at a hospital in Germany. And he divided basically the patients into two groups. He had his he called them dementia praecox patients, and then he had patients that we would call a manic depressive group today, sort of a bipolar group. And here's what he found with the outcomes for the manic depressive group. On the whole, that they would have a time of mania, or they would have a time of depression, or a time where they rotated, cycled between the two. But he concluded this. This is in 1921. Usually, all morbid manifestations completely disappear, but where that is exceptionally not the case, only a rather slight, peculiar psychic weakness develops. That's in 1921. Now, I'll just give you the outcomes for other people diagnosed with either depression only that are hospitalized, mania only, or both mania and depression. Here's a study by Horatio Pollack, New York State Mental Hospitals, of a group diagnosed with mania. First episode, 50% never suffered a second attack during an 11-year follow-up, and only 20% experienced 3 or more episodes. You're seeing a spectrum. 50% one episode, 30% had maybe 2 or 3 episodes over an 11-year period, and about 20% became chronically ill. Here's another big study. F.W. Wortham, John Hopkins, in a 1929 study of 2,000 manic depressive patients. 80% recovered within a year, and fewer than 1% required long-term hospitalization. Swedish study by Gunnar Lundqvist, 75 of the 103 recovered within 10 months, and during the following 20 years, half never had another attack. Only 8% developed a chronic course. 85% socially recovered and resumed their former positions. There was a long study out of the University of Iowa of 86 manic patients, concluded at the end of 30 years, 70% had good outcomes, which meant they married, lived in their own homes and work. Half were asymptomatic during this follow-up, and here's the key. So in 1969, George Whitaker reviewed this literature in greater depth that we've just done for manic patients. He said this: there is no basis to consider that manic depressive psychosis permanently affects those who suffer from it. He goes, while some people suffer multiple episodes, each episode is usually only a few months in duration, and quote, in a significant number of patients, only one episode of illness occurs. And then he goes, most important of all, once patients recover from an episode, they usually have no difficulty resuming their usual occupations. Finally, in terms of depression, that was very much understood as to be an episodic illness. If you looked at hospitalized patients, about 80 to 85% would be discharged within a year. And if we go back through that same literature, what do you find? Pollack did a long-term study of 2,700 depressed patients hospitalized from 1909 to 1920. Again, about half only had a single attack, and only 17% had 3 or more episodes. I can do the same. There's a number of studies that basically are saying that's the spectrum of outcomes for depression. And so sprinting ahead to 1972 review of this literature, Samuel Goose, Eli Robbins, they conclude that, once again, follow-up studies show that last 10 years, 50% of people hospitalized for depression had no recurrence of their illness. Only about 10% became chronically ill. So here was the view of depression in the late 1970s. This is Jonathan Cole, head of the NIMH's Psychopharmacology Service Center. He writes, depression is, on the whole, one of the psychiatric conditions with the best prognosis for eventual recovery with or without treatment. Most depressions are self-limited. George Whitaker, assurance can be given to a patient and to his family that subsequent episodes of illness can Sorry, missed this. Assurance can be given to a patient and to his family that subsequent episodes of illness after a first mania or first depression will not tend towards a more chronic course. Dean Schuyler, head of the depression section at the NIMH at this time, says, most depressive episodes, he wrote, will run their course and terminate with virtually complete recovery without specific intervention. So what do you see from this research? Schizophrenia was always seen as more severe, and probably the spectrum of outcomes isn't as good with the manic depressive group. But up until the late 1970s, the studies found that if you followed first episode patients hospitalized for mania, psychotic depression, or what we would call bipolar illness today, both of those really fall into the bipolar umbrella. Here was what they found. About 50% would have one episode only in long-term follow-up. About 30% would maybe have an episode of every couple years, and then finally maybe 20% would become chronically ill. And it was understood, both mania and depression were understood to be episodic disorders. So then what happened in 1980? We're going to get a reconceptualization of these disorders as chronic disorders. And how did that happen and why did it happen? Well, what happened is in the 1970s, the American Psychiatric Association felt it was under siege, that it was fighting for its survival as a medical discipline. And why was that so? You had an anti-psychiatry movement that came from within academic settings that said, oh, psychiatry serves more as an agency of social control. That was number one. The second thing was that there was a sense that its diagnoses were no good. In other words, that they really couldn't tell one type of disorder from another, and that was seen as a problem for a medical discipline. Its new big seller benzodiazepines were becoming understood to be addictive. And then next we had movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which sort of made fun of psychiatrists. There was a lot of internal dissension between the Freudians and the biologists. And you'll see that New York Times wrote a piece about psychiatry's anxious years. So what did they decide? And the biggest thing was there was no evidence that their talk therapy was any better than the talk therapy given by counselors, psychologists, etc. So with this sort of threat to their legitimacy, saying that psychiatry isn't a real medical discipline, the American Psychiatric Association said, how are we going to rebrand ourselves? How are we going to restore our image in society? And they said, and you can find this in their documents, we need to rebrand ourselves as doctors in white coats that treat real illnesses, because basically it's going to be an infectious disease model, because those are the doctors that have such great prestige and standing in society. So they're beginning in the 1970s, they said, or mid-1970s, we have to remedicalize things and we have to present ourselves as doctors, as like doctors who treat real illnesses. So they published the third edition of their diagnostic and statistical manual, and they reconceive of things as illnesses, separate illnesses. But what you're going to see is this reconceptualization did not arise from discoveries about the biology of mental disorders, but as a way to represent, to rebrand the image of psychiatry in society. And in 1983, Nancy Andreasen, as Ellis said, provided, quote, the first comprehensive account of the biological revolution in the diagnosis and treatment of mental illness. And here's how she explained the new thinking. The major psychiatric illnesses are diseases. They should be considered medical illnesses just as diabetes, heart disease, and cancer are. The emphasis in this model is on carefully diagnosing each specific illness from which the patient suffers, just as an internist or neurologist would. So that's the new story. Now, do you see the shift that's happening here? Before, psychiatric disorders were often seen as, well, first of all, the causes were seen as unknown, and we can talk about the different ideas, but the outcomes showed that they were often episodic. A person would have a time of being psychotic, or a time of mania, or a time of depression. And that's a model where you talk about that people can get back robust lives, okay? But now with this new conception that they're diseases of the brain and they're chronic, you're going to need, the best you can hope for is sort of a recovery within that disease. You're going to live with that disease, okay? And that's the reconceptualization. Now, that book takes the country by storm, but nobody was reading this part of the book. She says, she confesses, this is a hypothesis. This is not something that's been discovered. And then she goes, nonetheless, the spirit of a revolution, the sense that we are going to change things dramatically, even if the process requires a number of years, is very much present. So the idea was we're going to discover the causes of schizophrenia, discover the cause of depression, etc. And very quickly after that, we get the chemical imbalance story. And that's a story that validates the disease model. We were told that schizophrenia is due to too much dopamine. Drugs, antipsychotics block dopamine. That's why they're like insulin for diabetes. They're an antidote to this pathology. We were told that depression is due to too little serotonin. Antidepressants increase serotonin, and therefore they bring it back into balance. So that's a disease model story. That's the narrative we were told. And there were educational campaigns to convince the population that this was so. There were screening programs. And part of this story of this story of medical progress, is we did get new drugs. We got Prozac in 1988, which was said to be a drug that could help make you better than well. Then we get the whole SSRIs. By the way, in 1987, about 2% of the population took an antidepressant. And now we're up to like 15%, at least in the United States, although I think they're popular here too. And then we got the second generation of antipsychotic drugs like Risperdal, Zyprexa, and these drugs were said to also be breakthrough medications that fix chemical imbalances in the brain. And that was the story of a disease model, and we organized our thinking around that model. So, that's the big shift. We went away from conceiving psychiatric disorders as often episodic, and you could return to complete pre-morbid functioning, they would say, to that people have to live with these chronic diseases. That was the reconceptualization. Now, the key to this whole story of why we're now able to rethink this, arriving at a think of this, you got to look at the science into that chemical imbalance story. Is it true? Did they find that people with serotonin, depression had low serotonin? Did they find that people with schizophrenia had too much dopamine? And when you look into this, here's what you find. That story arose not from an understanding of what was happening in people, but from an understanding of how the drugs acted on the brain. So for example, antipsychotics were understood to block dopamine transmission in the brain. You know how neurons communicate. You have a presynaptic neuron, releases a chemical messenger into that tiny gap between neurons. That molecule binds with receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, and that's how messages are passed. What antipsychotics did is they blocked those receptors, so they thwarted dopamine, they thwarted the usual operations of the dopaminergic pathways. So researchers said, well, maybe then people with schizophrenia have too much dopamine, the opposite reaction. Same thing with serotonin. What happens with what they found that the action of antidepressants was, so serotonin gets released into that synaptic cleft. And then for that messaging system to be precise, you have to remove that molecule from that synaptic cleft. And it's removed in one of two ways, the serotonin. Either it's metabolized and the metabolites are carted off as waste, or it goes back up, it's reuptaken into the presynaptic neuron, restored there for later reuse. What antidepressants did is they blocked that reuptake process. Serotonin stayed longer in the synaptic cleft. So people hypothesized, well, maybe depression is due to too little serotonin, the opposite. So that's how it arose. It really goes back to 1965, the hypothesis, but by the early 1980s, they're testing this hypothesis. And I'm going to now just read you the findings or the conclusions by leaders in that field. First about the serotonin hypothesis of depression, and then about this dopamine hyperactivity theory of schizophrenia. 1984, the NIMH did a study of the low serotonin theory, and here's what they concluded. Elevations or decrements in the functioning of serotonergic systems per se are not likely to be associated with depression. Now, there was a bunch more of research. Prozac comes on the market in 1987. There's all sorts of research into the low serotonin theory. And then in 1999, the American Psychiatric Association's own textbook says the hypothesis didn't pan out. And I'll just read you how they say it. It's a bit, they go this. The monoamine hypothesis, serotonin is a monoamine, which was first proposed in 1965, holds that monoamines such as norepinephrine and serotonin are deficient in depression and that the action of antidepressants depends on increasing the synaptic availabilities of these monoamines. However, they write, this is in the APA's own textbook, inferring neurotransmitter pathophysiology from an observed action of a class of medications on neurotransmitter availability is similar to concluding that because aspirin causes gastrointestinal bleeding, headaches are caused by too much blood loss, and the therapeutic action of aspirin in headaches involves blood loss. Then they go this. Additional experience has not confirmed the monoamine depletion hypothesis. It didn't pan out. Meaning that within the profession itself in 1999, the low serotonin theory of depression was declared dead. 2000, we have from Stephen Stahl, there is no clear and convincing evidence that monoamine deficiency accounts for depression. That is, there is no real monoamine deficit. These are leaders in the field in terms of research. I'll give you two more. Eric Nestler, he's like one of the world's greatest neuroscientists in the investigation of this. He says, after more than a decade of PET studies, monoamine depletion studies, and genetic association analyses examining polymorphisms, there is little evidence to implicate true deficits in serotonergic, noradrenergic, or dopaminergic neurotransmission in the pathophysiology of depression. You'll find all sorts of comments like that related to serotonin. As opposed to the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia in 1994, there is no good evidence for the perturbation of the dopamine function in schizophrenia. That's John Kane. He's a big dopamine respecter. 2002, Stephen Hyman, he's the former director of the NIMH, he says there is no compelling evidence that a lesion in the dopamine system is a primary cause of schizophrenia. 2005, Kenneth Kindler, he was one of the world's researchers, he says about this whole chemical imbalance story, we have hunted for big, simple neurochemical explanations for psychiatric disorders, and we have not found them. Finally, I'll just give you a paper in 2022, just published recently by Nasser Ghami. He's a well-known psychiatrist at Tufts University. He says, biologically, antipsychotics are mainly dopamine blockers and standard antidepressants are mainly monoamine agonists. After their introduction in the 1990s, corresponding theories arose regarding the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia and the monoamine hypotheses for depression. Half a century of research has disproven these hypotheses. Dopamine overactivity and monoamine depletion are not parts of the pathogenesis of schizophrenia and depression, respectively. So what you see, here's the problem. We organized ourselves around a narrative that told us that the pathology of schizophrenia, the pathology of the causes of schizophrenia, the causes of depression, and really other disorders were due to chemical imbalances in the brain. And that's a story that tells you need to take your medication, and you need to take it forever, really, because you have to counterbalance this thing. And the tragedy is, it's not true. And in fact, they knew it was not true. It was declared dead long ago. In fact, I was given a talk in front of a grand rounds a while back at Massachusetts General Hospital, and I said to, I went over this, and I said, you knew this wasn't true a long time ago. The public was told this, and your science didn't support it. And you know what they said? Oh yeah, we knew this 25 years ago. And they were right. It really fell apart in the late 80s. But clearly they forgot to tell the public because surveys found in 2005, 2007, even more recently, 80 to 85% of the public now knows that psychiatric disorders are due to chemical imbalances in the brain. So that's the heart of the problem we've had. We organized ourselves around a false narrative. I'm running a little late here. I was going to go over the idea whether the disorders in the DSM have been validated as real diseases. In other words, were they validated as discrete disorders? And then I was going to read a bunch of quotes that saying by people that know, like, these have not been validated by real diseases. I'll just read a couple of them. Here's from NIMH Director Thomas Insel. The strength of each of these editions of DSM has been reliability. Each edition has ensured that clinicians use the same term in the same ways. The weakness is its lack of validity. These really haven't been established as discrete disorders. How about Nancy Andreasen, the very person that launched this with her book, The Broken Brain, this whole revolution? DSM diagnoses are not useful for research because of their lack of validity. DSM diagnoses have given researchers a common nomenclature, but probably the wrong one. And there's one after another about this. There was a panel when they were doing DSM-5 where they brought 20 experts in diagnosis around and they said, have we validated any of these disorders? And everybody said no. I'll give you one from here locally. This is from Joel Paris at McGill University in 2012. He says, while in principle, science should be the basis of any diagnostic system, DSM has been seduced by the illusion that advances in neuroscience provide empirical validity for a new system. In reality, we do not know whether conditions like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or obsessive-compulsive disorder are true diseases. So we started this saying that this biological story collapsed. You see that the chemical imbalance story didn't turn out to be true. We see that the efforts to validate disorders, you validate a disorder by finding the pathology and you see a drug that is specific to that disorder. Maybe you find a gene base. The gene search didn't pan out either. So these whole foundations are crumbling. And then finally the crumbling part is this. In study after study, what we are finding today is that schizophrenia runs a chronic course for virtually everyone. Depression now runs a chronic course. Bipolar runs a chronic course. I'm going to just give you outcomes real quickly from a couple studies, and then we can talk about why this leads us now to a place we can imagine a different future that's much more optimistic. And we can talk briefly about some of the ways that people are doing that. I'm just running a little long here, I see. And I'll talk about major NIMH studies that were done to see how are people in real clinical care faring under this paradigm of care, okay? Now, the largest study in depression was called the STAR-D study. 4,041 patients were entered into the study. These are outpatients. These aren't even inpatients. And the idea was we'll prove that people can get well on antidepressants and stay well. And the way it was designed was this. If you didn't get well on the first antidepressant, you could try another. If you didn't get one on the second, you could try a third. And eventually you'd get 4 chances to remit or get better on an antidepressant. And then the idea was if you did remit, you'd go into a follow-up care, and then for a year they'd see if they could keep you well, all right? Now, this is, you can read in the paper and stuff that 70% of the people remitted. Didn't happen. There's so much fraud, and this study should actually be retracted. And people have gone back and looked at the protocol and looked at the case data, said only 26% of the people ever remitted in that study. In other words, they got fully the depression left. But the real kicker was this. How many people were well, still in the trial, and got well, stayed in the trial, and hadn't relapsed at the end of 1 year? That's your stay well rates. Out of 4,041, there were only 108 patients in that stay well category. And we saw before we were seeing like 80% doing well at the end of 1 year. And then the NIMH did a study of unmedicated depression at the end of 1 year. And lo and behold, they found 85% were well. So that's an example where what you see is a chronic course in the STAR-D study, but when they went ahead and tried a study of unmedicated depression, they found this 85 stay well rate. And the person even said, like, this is just what we used to see. Anyway, here's the new course of depression. Remember, it was talked about as episodic before? Here's what the textbook now say. Only about 1/3 will remit on antidepressants, I mean get fully better. This isn't when they're initially exposed. 1/3 are partial responders, but then end up with a chronic course. And 1/3 are non-responders, and they also end up with a chronic course. So here's the description in the APA textbook, which is so different from what they were saying in the 1970s. Quote, only 15% of people with unipolar depression experience a single bout of the illness. The remaining 85%, with each new episode, remissions become less complete and new recurrences develop with less provocation. The NIMH now advises an episode of major depression may occur only once in a person's lifetime, but more often it recurs throughout a person's life. So we went from advice in the 1970s saying you're going to get better, it's an episodic disorder, to now it's running a chronic course. By the way, the NIMH investigators, when they had that outcome of 85% better at 1 year, they said these results provide perhaps the most methodologically rigorous confirmation of the previous estimates we saw in the pre-antidepressant era. In the longitudinal study with schizophrenia, just so you know this, this is by Martin Harrow and Thomas Jobe. I told you what the outcomes were for the unmedicated patients. By the way, the ones that had milder psychotic disorders who ended up, that stayed off the drugs, they had really good outcomes. Anyway, the recovery rate was 8 times higher for those who got off medication than those who were medication compliant over the 8 years. So the recovery rate was 40% for those off medication and 5% for those on medication, and they were also much more likely to have a very poor outcome. So that's a second big NIMH study. As far as bipolar, it is now well recognized that outcomes today are much worse than in the pre-lithium era. You get, and here's, there was a 2007 paper by Ross Baldassarrini. Here's what he says. Ross Baldassarrini is one of the most famous psychopharmacologists in the world. It goes back to, his work goes back to the 60s at Harvard University. He says, in the pre-drug era, there was recovery to euthymia, that's no symptoms, and a favorable functional adaptation between episodes. Now today, he says, there is slow or incomplete recovery from acute episodes, continued risk of recurrences, and sustained morbidity over time. He said before 85% of patients would regain complete premorbid functioning and return to work. Now only 1/3 achieve full social and occupational functional recovery to their own premorbid levels. Before they didn't show cognitive impairment over the long time. Now they do show cognitive impairment, and here's what he summed it up. Prognosis for bipolar disorder was once considered relatively favorable, but contemporary findings suggest that disability and poor outcomes are prevalent despite major therapeutic advances. So what we see when we go back to that pre-1980 era is that there was thoughts that there were many causes of psychiatric problems. Could be biological. There was a thought that it could be like environmental causes, especially when we go back to the war. There was a faction within psychiatry that thought that, oh, it also has to do with social things like poverty. There was a lot of different things, but the most important thing we can get from that time is there was an understanding that for many people they would have a time of illness and they'd get better and they would return to a robust life. And really what you see again and again is this, a percentage that would have one episode, a percentage that would have maybe periodic episodes, and then there's a final group that becomes chronically ill. Now, if you go back to that conception, you might say, okay, a couple things. What do we need to sort of improve on that natural capacity to recover? And one of the things we know that certain things like, you know, good diet, exercise, meaning in life, finding a place in life, all those sort of environmental things can certainly support people and help people get better and help people stay well. And also, it lends itself to the idea that maybe what we need is a selective use of psychiatric medications, because you see the spectrum of outcomes, and basically you start to see there's one group of a first episode that can get better without the medications. There's a second group that seems to need them for a time, and there's a third group that maybe needs to stay on them, okay? And that's basically what you saw with that Satiri experiment in the 1970s, was this 40% never needed to go on the drugs, 40% used them temporarily, and 20% long-term. So, proof of principle, and then we'll get questions. I've gone a little long. Part of this reconceptualization is, how do we build upon this natural capacity to recover? And it really begins with a reconceptualization that says nature is telling us people often can get well. Anyway, a group that reconceptualized things in 1992 was a group in northern Finland. And what they said in 1992 is, we're going to say that psychosis does not occur inside the head, but psychosis occurs in the in-between spaces. And that basically when you have a psychotic person, they're no longer able to be with others. So what we need to do is repair those in-between spaces. And as part of this, they said, we're going to use antipsychotics in a selective use manner. We're not going to put people on initially, because we have found that if their emotions are not muted by antipsychotics, they're better able to engage in the dialogical therapy, where they would bring family members and friends in and almost try to set up like people around a dinner table where you can be with others again. But then if people weren't getting better for a while, they would put them on antipsychotic medication for a period of time, and then they'd see who could come off. So they ended up with a group that would never go on, a group that would be on temporarily for like 6 months, and a group that needed to be on the drugs long term. And now, if you went there, as I did, you would see this is not an anti-drug model. This is a best use model. How do we see who needs them and for how long? Anyway, they adopted this way of doing things in 1992. And at the end of 5 years, here's where their outcomes. Of their first episode psychotic patients, 80% would be working or back in school at the end of 5 years and asymptomatic. Only 20% would have gone on to disability and sort of a chronic course. And of medication use, it was like this. 2/3 of their patients at the end of 5 years were never exposed to the drugs. 13% used them temporarily, and 20% used them long-term. And so you see how that sort of fits? Going back to that old epidemiological data of 67% sort of getting well in 1945 to 55. That's really what they were finding with this form of care. Now it's intense psychosocial care. They try to build bridges to make sure people can be back with their families and either go back to school, go back to work. They're trying to rebuild a social sort of system for people, support people, and they also try to give them a different narrative. The narrative patients hear today so often is, oh, you have this chronic illness and you're going to have to live it for life. And there's sort of a pessimism around what is possible. They changed that and said, we're going to help you get your life back. And we're going to help you build a narrative where you can be with others and that sort of thing. Oh, and by the way, just one small thing, going back to the Harrow study, in that group that was off medication and recovered, they had dropped out of care. And he just managed to follow them as they went through their life. And he found people who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. One became a lawyer, there was a teacher, and the others were had blended back into society. But of course, they no longer told people they once had a diagnosis of schizophrenia. He says, we don't see these good outcomes. Anyway, we've now reached this moment where it is recognized that biological story, which was a hypothesis, didn't pan out in terms of scientific discoveries. We know that there's still people wanting to find the pathology, but we haven't found it, okay? That's the first thing. The second thing is the DSM diagnoses are understood now to be constructs and not actually validated, something that validates one illness separate from the other. That's well recognized. And third, it's well recognized that the outcomes aren't good. They're running too much of a chronic course, and the burden of illness keeps going up and up. And Tom Insel in his book says, how is it that more and more people getting treated, and yet all the markers for the burden of mental illness are getting worse? Real quickly, I'm going to just read a couple last things, and then we'll have time for questions. I've gone a little long. Just so you hear this. This is Danius Pyrrhus, UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health. The urgent need for a shift in approach should prioritize policy innovation at the population level, targeting social determinants, and abandon the predominant medical model that seeks to cure individuals by targeting disorders. So we can say at a social level is we should start thinking about how do we create societies that better nurture each other and us all, our kids, that sort of thing. Now here's the World Health Organization. It's a little loud, but I just want to show you that this is not coming from some place of heresy, what I've talked about, but it's really now a mainstream call for a rethinking of psychiatry and a paradigm shift. They write, a fundamental shift within the mental health field is required in order to end this current situation. This means rethinking policies, laws, systems, services, and practices across the different sectors which negatively affect people with mental health conditions and psychosocial disabilities, ensuring that human rights underpin all actions in the field of mental health. In the mental health service context specifically, this means a move towards a more balanced, person-centered, holistic, and recovery-oriented practices that consider people in the context of their whole lives, respecting their will and preferences in treatment, implementing alternatives to coercion, and promoting people's right to participation and community inclusion. By the way, I mentioned the thing about open dialogue in northern Finland. There's a Soteria project going on in Israel where basically they're trying to replicate that Soteria experiment in the 1970s where people live with each other, and the idea is that being with others can be a path over time to getting your life back. Now, I visited there. Medications are used if people want them, and if they're not, they're allowed to taper off them. And some people are completely off, and I have to tell you, when you go to the Soteria house, it's a lot of fun. We can talk about it, because people are quite lively. In Norway now, the health minister of Norway has demanded that all health organizations start providing medication-free treatment in the hospital for patients who want it. There's now a private hospital outside of Oslo that is devoted to helping people get off medication, and what they get recommended to them or referred to them are really the most chronic cases. Their first patient, that was once they opened their doors about 5 years ago. By the way, this was all came from patient sort of initiatives and also pointing to the research literature is why the government began supporting this. Their first patient had been hospitalized 241 times. She'd been held in isolation for the previous 3 years. Basically, she'd been hospitalized from age 13 to age 33. She was on 31 medications when she arrived. Now, what did the psychiatric nurses that started this, what is the very first thing now she had been in isolation for 3 years because they thought she was a suicide risk, couldn't be trusted, and now she finally got to this place. So the very first thing they did to this woman when she was referred to her, they said, I think you need a vacation. And they sent her to Mallorca with a nurse, which what were they showing? You can be trusted. And this was a whole different way of being. She now works at the hospital. She's lost like 130 pounds. She's down to 2 drugs. And she says, I got my life back. So that's what I'm trying to say is there are initiatives out there that are happening to really provide sort of a more holistic care, a thing that builds on what we all know. What do we need in life? We need meaning in life. It's really helpful to love someone or have someone love you. It's good to have, good food, diet, exercise as sort of a foundation. And then also there is this thought in this merging rethinking that These disorders can be episodic if we don't do things to turn them chronic. Now Nasser Ghaemi, I'm going to close with this quote. And then I'll tell you one little personal story that I just discovered not too long ago, actually. Nasser Ghaemi is a big biological guy. He's like Mr. Bipolar in the United States. And here's what he wrote in his 2022 paper. Most psychiatric drugs have not been proven in properly designed randomized trials to improve the course of any illness they are purported to treat. Specifically, they have not been shown to prevent hospitalization or extend life, as many clinicians believe. Short-term symptomatic benefit, that's how these drugs get approved, because they knock down the symptoms better than placebo over the short term, should not be presumed to provide long-term disease-modifying benefits in psychiatry. Since most psychiatric drugs are symptomatic, they should be used mostly short-term rather than long-term and at lower doses. He would not have written this 10 years ago. So the Copernicus analogy was sort of fitting in the sense that if I would have given this talk 10 years ago, and I was giving this talk sort of 10 years ago, differently, but just going over the outcomes for medicated patients, it would be seen as heresy. It's not today. Because what is now recognized is the disease model never panned out. The drugs don't fix a known pathology. The DSM diagnoses are constructs. They're not validated diseases. And outcomes with this form of care, this disease model, which envisions things as chronic illnesses. That's the irony of this, is it's not producing good outcomes at a social level or really for individual levels. And instead what we're seeing, these disease conditions that used to be episodic for so many people are now running a chronic course. And so why is this good news? It's good news because at the heart of this is the sense that we can abandon the sense that these are necessarily chronic when you have a psychotic episode or a manic break, or you have a deep descent into depression. But that what nature is telling us, there's so often a capacity to recover and get back a full life and not live with the psychiatric disorder. That's what history and science are telling us. And I'll tell you the personal story here. When I first wrote about this whole story, was a book called Mad in America, which was published in 2002. And I had no personal involvement with psychiatry. Didn't know about it in my family or anything like that. And then all of a sudden, my mom goes, "Oh, you know, your dad was in the hospital." I go, "No, I didn't know this." Turns out, but my dad was one of those people. He served in World War II. He was a lieutenant. He commanded an artillery group. He spent a fair amount of time in a foxhole getting shelled or shelling other people. And he was one of the people, it turns out, when he came back, he had a breakdown. But the interesting thing is when I finally asked my dad about that, and I said, "Well, what did they tell you?" And they said, because he had started working by this time when he had this breakdown. And his bosses told him, "Oh, don't worry, you'll be better. Your job will be waiting for you." And that's precisely what happened. He was in the hospital for about 6 months, and then he never had another problem in his whole life. So, and just so you know, I run a webzine called Mad in America, and we now have affiliates in 11 countries. And all these affiliates are devoted to this idea is the disease model has failed. What can we imagine in its place? And let's look at alternatives. Let's look at research that tells us of better ways. This weekend, we're going to be doing a piece about something called the nurtured heart approach, which is now taking off in schools across the country and even in other countries. And rather than diagnosing kids with ADHD, it's a way of getting the schools to basically create a different environment for the kids. And what do you see? You see ADHD diagnoses go way down, delinquency problems go way down. So that's one of the things we're trying to do is highlight alternatives, report on alternatives that do tell of this much more optimistic possibility. And that, I think, is what we can all grab onto, is we can reconceive these things. It doesn't mean there's easy answers. And you do see, even in the data, there's a group that ends up chronic. But it's a much more optimistic vision from that first moment when people have trouble of what's possible. So, thank you. So I think I went about 10 minutes long. But I think there's time for questions. I think they're going to want you to go up to the mic, if that's okay. Or maybe...
Yeah, if you want to come to the mic, or I can come up to you. That's easy.
Thank you for the presentation. My question has a military context and post-traumatic stress disorder. It hasn't been particularly well handled by the military in Canada, and I don't know in the United States. So the question I have is that why isn't, since the military have jets at 80 and 90 million dollars and all kinds of expensive equipment, they can't come up with some serious treatments in that area? Thank you.
Well, y'all heard that question. This is a great question. What happened in the military, because the U.S. military is the same thing, they really adopted this disease model. And they actually screen all their veterans now, and they're diagnosing more and more veterans. But there's a big study showing that, and we reported on this as well, is that getting diagnosed and treated, you look at the people that get diagnosed and treated next to those who sort of avoid that disease model. It's this group that does better in terms of employment and basically where they're at, lower suicide rates years later. So one of the problems is, let's go back to 1945. The conception for my dad and others was, they were traumatized by the war, the experience in the war. And the first thing was that time could heal. And being in a different environment could heal. You had to recognize it, but there was a sense that this trauma, you could get beyond it. But now we've even sort of conceptualized PTSD as a chronic condition. Like you're going to continue to have it. But that's a new conception. I mean, just listen, trauma does affect us physically. And, then there's good studies about what happens to kids who are traumatized. We have something called the ACE study. They have a lot more difficulty in life later on. So I don't want to diminish this. But one of the problems is we're seeing returning military veterans in this disease model lens, as opposed to these are people who went out and, especially if they got into war conditions, that's really hard on human beings. And again, so it's not recognizing enough of think about the disease model, PTSD, the problem's inside you. That's what they say, right? Problem's inside you. Well, no, the problem was that they were in an environment that became so difficult for them, and they're trying now to get their lives back. But the problem with the way we're treating PTSD, in my opinion, is that we're pathologizing it, as opposed to seeing it as something that happened in response to the environment. And Mad in America has had a page for veterans talking about this. Like they went, and what happens? Next thing you know, they're leaving the clinic with 4 medications. It's just not working. But it's a great question. But it's again about how does society take care of people are struggling for whatever reason, kids, others.
Hi. I have an 18-year-old son diagnosed with schizophrenia, first episode. I wanted to start with a holistic approach. Unfortunately, he was medicated and hospitalized, and every time he stopped medication, I noticed that the psychotic episodes were extremely worse. So my question is, how do we now go from medicated to holistic?
Wow, thank you. That's a really good question. Can I say something? You noticed that the episodes are now worse, right?
If he stops medication.
Yeah, this actually came up early in the 1960s. So early in the 1960s, when clinicians still had a memory of people not being medicated, and now they medicate, and then people stop the medication, they said, wow, relapses are becoming more severe than they used to be. And there was this whole sense that something was going on with the drugs that changed the brain that made you more vulnerable to psychosis over the long term, and that really showed up when you came off the drug. It was Canadian researchers that in the early 1980s, I think they were at McGill, who put together what was happening, and what they came to understand was antipsychotics block dopamine. Now, profoundly so. Now, your brain being this extraordinarily neuroplastic organ, it tries to compensate for the presence of the drug, and it does so by increasing the density of its dopamine receptors. And the research, I can't remember if they were at a university in either McGill or University of Montreal, I don't know. Guy Chenard and Barry Jones, I think, were their names. I mean, I know Guy Chenard was the name. And they said the brain is now super sensitive to dopamine, and this has two effects. When you come off, think about this. The drug acts as a brake. Your brain puts down the accelerator, right? That's the extra receptors. Now you take away the brake. You've got this dysregulation of the dopamine system. And they said that's what makes people more vulnerable to relapse than before, and also why they're having more severe relapses. That was put together in the 1980s. And then Martin Harrow and Thomas Job found that same thing in their long-term study. People, it's real interesting, people got off medication and then stabilized, remained very stable, but there's this period when you come off that's really difficult. But they said, we're also seeing people becoming chronically psychotic, and they revisited this dopamine supersensitivity theory. So what I'm saying to you is, there's a sense that initial exposure is a bit of a trap, because you get used to the drug and then it's hard to get off. Now, the real question is this: how do we go back? Because what they're taught to do in the standard of care is to get people on antipsychotics right away and maintain them on that. And yet the long-term recovery rate for that is 6%. And you get these weight gains, you get this lack of functioning, emotional engagement, you know, all this sort of things. And your son is 18 years old. Can I ask you a question, if you don't mind? Any chance he was doing drugs before he had a psychotic episode? Okay. This is the other thing we need to address. This is not old organic schizophrenia. If you go into emergency rooms today and you find people with the first episode of psychosis, so many of them have been doing marijuana, other illicit drugs, or stimulants, or antidepressants. So you should be treated for drug-induced psychosis. That's what you should be treated for. They don't have a chronic illness, they did drugs. But how do we turn this around? Public's got to say, we want to do something differently. In Norway, the way they got this is, now Norway's a small country and it has all these sort of democratic channels. But they basically lobbied for this for years, this medication-free treatment. They brought me over like a number of times to argue with the psychiatrists about what the literature showed. And the health minister finally said, yeah, there's an evidence-based reason for treating people without medication. And now they have a medication-free ward for psychotic patients in Tromsø, which is quite to the north. And you know what they're finding? Especially with early episode or first episode, they can get people off. I mean, people can do okay. But how do we bring this to our society? As I can say, and then in Israel, they're starting to do some of this. Somehow we have to make the plea for saving our kids. I mean, I'm going to, your son is like, there's two roads out here. You know what I mean? We got to give him the chance to go down this other road. We need to do that. That's what our obligation to your son is. And if we just push him down this permanent thing, he won't have a full life. I guarantee you. He'll be numb, he'll get heavy, very likely he won't work. You know what by the way, the people in the Harrow study off medication, you know what the work rate was? Diagnosed with schizophrenia. Between 80 and 90%. And you know what happened? Now, this was the best longitudinal study funded by the NIMH. It's so upset the powers that be, they don't talk about this in their textbooks. They don't talk about it to the public, so we don't hear about it. And what we really, and I hope you see this, I'm not anti-drug. Figure out how to use them. But just be honest about what they do, honest about the outcomes, and then we can have a society that builds its thinking around informed consent. And that's not what we have right now. And I'm sorry about your son. I mean, I hear these stories that it just breaks my heart. I mean, yeah.
Mr. Whitaker, I thank you for your interesting observations. You've obviously been thinking about this for a long time. I appreciate your noting the social and cultural aspects as well as historical trends. And I mean, you didn't even get into the role of the drug companies or the anti-science phenomenon within science itself. But I'm curious, just as you've been thinking about this for a long time, do you think there is a brain issue in mental health or not?
Oh, listen, sure. There's many different pathways to depression. There's many different pathways to mania, and there's many different pathways to psychosis. Now, I'm very much a guy that believes that, we're biological creatures, okay? So clearly biology is engaged in how we respond to the world. The question, though, is there a discrete pathology that, is common to all people so diagnosed? And I'm sure that's not true because they haven't found it. The biology has remained so mysterious about what is going on. And one of the problems is we have people in these categories that are so different. And that's what you're seeing in the spectrum of outcomes, by the way, that there's different things happening to people. So I don't think we should give up the effort to find out, like, the biological, if there are biological things happening to people, or at least say a group of the people. Don't give that up. It's just that it hasn't been found as a discrete, as a common characteristic to, people so diagnosed. And so what I'm going for is we have to be honest about what we do and we do not know. And what we don't know is that there is a characteristic chemical imbalance, or there's a certain gene or anything like that. But we can keep looking for these things, and maybe what you'll find is that, let's say with psychosis, there's a certain group that does have something, and then you can really target that. With this thing is we could try to figure out, well, what happens to the brain if you end up psychotic after you do marijuana? What has happened there? And then now we can have a treatment for marijuana-induced psychosis. So I'm a big biological guy, okay? And I love these but the brain is a mysterious place. And psychiatric disorders are mysterious. And I also think this is true. Human beings are emotional ups and downs. I mean, go read your literature. Go read your religious tracts. We don't go steady state through the world. We're riven with these fierce emotions. Depression, I mean, lots of, depressions can be common. Mania can be common. Just don't sleep for a while. So we were talking on the way over here, Gabor Mate has this book, The Myth of Normalcy, or Myth of Normality. That's part of the problem, too, with this disease model, is that over here are the normal people and over here are the abnormal people. That's just not true. And what you all know is that if things go bad for you, if you have setbacks in life, first of all, if you go to war, you get shelled, that can be traumatic. If you're a little kid and you're beaten or you don't have a safe space, you're bullied, that can be traumatic, and that's going to have a biological effect on you. Don't sleep, that can be a problem. Get divorced, that can be a problem. Lose your job, that can be a problem. We humans are built to be responsive to our environment, and there's a biology involved in that. But somehow, with this disease model, we completely forgot about how humans respond to the environment. That's one. And how about a philosophy of being, which tells you that human beings are very emotional creatures. They have ups and downs. They change over time. And so there's just this sort of steady state idea of people not too happy, not too sad. It just doesn't exist. That's another thing we need to do, is reimagine a philosophy of being that explains that kids have troubles growing up. They do stupid things. You still do stupid things after you grow up. But we need a philosophy of being really that you find in, I believe, religious texts, and I'm not religious, but they tell you incredible stories about how people are just swept away by their emotions. And look at literature, look at your Shakespeare. That's, if we want to have an understanding of psychiatric difficulties, I think we should just read all of Shakespeare and then we get a good understanding. Anyway, I just hope it's clear. It's like, I'm a biological guy. It's just what do we do know or not know? And I'm sure there's some biological substrates to some problems.
First of all, thank you so much. I've read both your books. I've actually given Mad in America to several people.
That's good to hear.
I actually had a question that's on perhaps the opposite end of the spectrum of the woman who asked a couple of questions ago, and that is, I have a family member who might be considered in that kind of chronic camp, because you've talked about the optimism of, say, the group that is, have one episode and then go on to perhaps not have any others in their lives, or the group that's episodic. But that 20% consistent chronic group, I have a family member who's unmedicated for many, many years and seems to be in that group and is now on medication to try and manage that. I'm curious to hear from you and your research, that 20% group that seems fairly consistent throughout the decades. What are we seeing there? What hope are we seeing for that group in terms of the advancement of our science? Because as long as we're chained to this disease model, as long as we're not looking at other solutions or other options, how are we going to better address the 20%ers who are the most affected and who are the most who have the most to lose?
Did you all hear that question? It's a really great question. That there's this group that seems destined to be sort of chronically ill or dealing with the symptoms and all. 20%. Yeah, the 20%ers. And this shows that there's no panacea here. And this is the spectrum of outcomes you see in the literature, and that's the best thing you can see. I don't think we know about the spectrum of outcomes for marijuana-induced psychosis. That's a different thing. But going here, so what do you do? Well, one of the things I like, for example, about open dialogue is the best use of medication. So try medication for this person. Now, the old thing is, try to find as low a dose as possible, that sort of thing. But everybody I know who has tried to do it this way has found some use for medication, especially with the 20%. Go to the open dialogue people, they end up with 20% on medication. However, that doesn't mean that should be the end-all and be-all, okay? That should be one part of a larger effort to help that person rebuild a life or get a better life. I'll give you an example of some of the things I know. One of the things I really love, there's a guy in Connecticut. He runs a program called Volunteers for Psychotherapy. And he's working with people who've come out of mental hospitals, and many of my guests would be probably in this 20%. So here's what he does. I'll give you an hour of free psychotherapy every week, but you have to pay for it in this way. You got to do 2 hours of volunteer work. So what happens now when they do volunteer work? Well, they go work in shelters, or they bring food, or whatever it might be. Work with the homeless. What is that person doing when they're volunteering work? They're no longer the person being helped. They're helping somebody else. They're going to find meaning in that, very likely, if you can get them to do that. They get out of the house. And now they have a way to go. If anyone asks them, well, what do you do? It's not, I'm a mental patient. It's, I work with the homeless, or I work in an animal shelter. That's just an example of how you can, if you can build up this world around people, or help them find a world where they can find meaning, they can find friendship, socialization, being with others, that over and over again, wherever you find in the research literature, when they can help that, make that happen, housing, that sort of thing, even with that sort of chronic group, they get better. Now, they may not get back a totally robust life or anything like that, but what so often happens with the chronic group is everything disappears around them. Social life, ability to have meaning in life, that sort of thing. So, great question. And again, this should be part of the societal discussion. When I said it's episodic, it's not episodic for everyone. And that seems to be quite clear.
Okay, I'm just going to say thank you to everyone for watching online. We had 150 people about the entire time, which is pretty great. So I have one question from someone online that I'm going to ask, from Melissa, saying, who's asking, what do you see as the biggest step forward based on what we know now, and where do we go from here?
The biggest step we now is what we're doing right here tonight, is we need an informed public. And so we can have a public discussion that is based not on a false story, that sort of narrative that it really was propaganda that promoted American Psychiatric Association, and someone mentioned pharma money. Yeah, pharma money helped promote that story, okay? What we need is a discussion about what do we know about psychiatric disorders, what is possible, and how do we best create, as Danius Purr said, the WHO said, how do we create a sort of holistic form of care that really helps maximize the possibility of a good long-term outcome? And part of this is a conceptual is the problem's not just in the person's head. That's where the disease model puts it. It's in the in-between spaces. It's in environments that people inhabit. And you regularly see that if you change environment, often people get better. So, but how do we cause, this is the question. How do we have a society that is going to grapple with this and rethink this based on this sort of information? Because you need informed consent. You need an informed public. What is known, what's not known, and we need humility within the science. It's not embarrassment to not know things, but don't tell us you know things that you don't know. How can we have that discussion? How can we have an informed public? Now, what I've been doing, that's why I started Mad in America, is because we have a webzine. We get about 5 million visitors a year, and we have a daily science report. So you can read, and we also do MI in-depth reports about, like we have one this weekend about the nurtured heart approach. So we're trying to become a vehicle for informing the public of this story, of the science, of possibilities, etc. Now the problem is, for whatever reason, the media is still sort of swamped by the conventional narrative, even though it's fallen apart. But the interesting thing for me is that, so we started Mad in America about 10 years ago. It came out after Anatomy of an Epidemic. We now have affiliates in 11 countries, and there are going to be 2 more. And it's because there is this growing sense in country after country that this disease model hasn't worked. And so what we need to do is sort of spread this information, make it known, and let it be known this. I once read something like this. You can assess the merits of a society by how well it takes care of the unfortunate, including those who end up with psychiatric difficulties. And that's how you can really judge how ethical, how moral, how caring the society is. The disease model completely fails that test because it puts the whole blame on the inside of the person's head. And what I'm here tonight and other people are saying is, let's take a collective responsibility for creating a world where when people have difficulties, we can help build a better environment for them. You know, one of the things we just reported on in Mad in America was the simplest study. So they looked at poor families, and they looked at poor families. This was a long-running study in the United States. And they looked at poor families where they got economic assistance, the kids were in families, and ones that didn't, okay? And guess what they found? The economic assistance to poor families led to kids with many fewer problems 15 years later. Very simple thing. Now, is that surprising? Because if you're in a poor family where you don't have enough food on the table, you can know there's going to be stresses, right? But there's an example of, this question's so great, and my question is, we need to have a different discussion, a different understanding of and part of that is what's possible, because we can replace this disease model which sort of says you're going to be chronically ill, you're at fault, And that, by the way, gives society a free pass, right? Oh, we don't have to do anything. It's all the individual's point. Anyway, somehow we have to change our society, which is a big deal. We need to change the societal discussion. I think I'm going to get the hook. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you so much. I do believe that the real challenge right now is really to decrease the gap between knowledge and practice. And I think that what you are doing today and what you are going to do tomorrow, hopefully, is going to contribute for this effort. As a complimentary virtual gift to you, I would like to give a very warm recommendation to Gabor Mate's latest book, The Myth of Normal. I think that it would really complement very well Robert Whitaker's lecture, and it will make you hopefully a little bit more convinced in what you have heard tonight. So thank you very much for coming in, and see you next time.